Let's take a few seconds. Da-da-da. People are arriving. Okay. Okay. Good morning, everybody. As you know, we have here a guest, another guest after last week, Professor Eloisa Betti from the University of Bologna. She is going to talk about the ILO conventions and women workers in the history of the second half of the 20th century. So please, Eloisa, the floor is yours. I go.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here with you and Professor Meki. I wish to thank you, Professor Meki, for this kind invitation. Well, just let me see if, okay. I will share the screen so you can see, hopefully, the PowerPoint. Great. Okay. Yeah, I'm just okay. And let's just see if it moves. No, there is another. Okay, this is not this one. Yeah.
We could see something different.
Yeah. Okay. Hello, everybody. I'm going to share the screen with you for making the PowerPoint available. Just sorry for just close it. I didn't want to, but I did. So just a bit of patience. Okay, here we are again. Great. Then I need to. Yes, it's a bit tricky with the Zoom because I don't think I managed, sorry, to share the screen properly for the students at home. Today is...
Can you see from home? Can you see the slides? Hello?
No, Professor.
No,
No,
yeah, no, they can't because I think, yeah. Let's try again. Ah, okay, here. I think. Oh, scusa.
Qui.
Sì, va bene, uguale.
Can you see it now? No.
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 Il problema è l'accesso Zoom perché qui non si visualizza, non riesco a capire il motivo. Così.
Vuoi ingrandire questo? Questa qui è la nostra. Vedi che no.
Ah, ok.
Ok,
e
da qui probabilmente è questo?
Sì, uno è uguale, credo, sai, però l'importante...
Ok, now I think it's good. Sorry.
Okay, I think now we manage to arrange the technology.
Yes.
So thank you for being here. Thank you, Professor Meki. I'm going to talk about a topic that I hope will be of some interest for you. My talk is going to be about women's work in ILO Convention between production and reproduction, and I will try to explain why I decided to use such a concept. But I would like to start saying that the history of the ILO is very connected to women's work since its very foundation. I underlined a few sentences in the ILO Constitution from 1999, where women were clearly, let's say, quoted in the preamble of the Constitution. And this very same quotation in red basically underline the two main concepts that are behind the relationship between women's work and the ILO Convention. The protection of women on the one hand, that is very often associated with the protection of children and youngest, and on the other hand, the recognition of the principle of equal remuneration for work of equal value. But more in general, as I would say in a minute, the two very concepts that are, let's say, behind the convention, which addresses explicitly women's work, are, we can, let's say, summarize in two main concepts. On the one hand, equality, and behind equality, the professor Eileen Boris, which is one of the main important scholars in who has, let's say, addressed in very multiple publications the issue of women's work. Eileen Boris clearly stated that on the one hand, ILO convention were to include all workers, regardless of sex. But on the other hand, some ILO convention regards specifically women workers, because women workers require targeted instruments addressing bodily function and social circumstances, above all, maternity on the one hand, and on the other hand, family responsibilities. So we can understand the relationship between ILO conventions and women's work if we, let's say, pick these two concepts and keep in mind equality and protection on the other hand. So since the very same foundation of the ILO in the ILO constitution, we can, let's say, recognize these two concepts. On the one hand, the protection, this is the reason why I underline the quotation, and on the other hand, the concept of equality. But this very same concept came back again in the Declaration of Philadelphia, and probably you have already, let's say, addressed these important documents. What I wanted to, let's say, underline here is that the Declaration of Philadelphia, on the one hand, stressed again the issue of equality, saying that all human beings, irrespective of race, creed, or sex, have the same right to pursue both their material well-being and their spiritual development in condition, again, of freedom, dignity, of economic security, and equal opportunity. So here you find again the concept of equality. On the other hand, the conference recognized also provision for child welfare and maternity protection. This is another very important aspect of the ILO action towards women's work. Maternity, we will see there were several protections regarding maternity, several conventions, and so this is another important aspect of the relationship between women's work and the ILO convention. This is just a preamble of my talk, because I would like to share with you some, let's say, topics today that try to address the diverse field in which women's work was addressed by the ILO. But first of all, I would like also to remind that women workers were very often the object of convention, but less often they were the subject who basically wrote the convention. In fact, this is a quotation again by Eileen Boris, and this is quite relevant for understanding the effort that women at different levels made throughout ILO history to, let's say, address women's work, because they were very few at the International Labour Conference, for instance, both as delegates and technical advisors. So when we think about the number of conventions that somehow address women's work, we need to keep in mind such an aspect, because as we know, representation is very important in general to, let's say, ensure that some specific topic are dealt with. So this is an aspect that I wanted to include here in my own talk today. These are two recent publications. The first one, Women's ILO from 2018, and the second one, Making the Woman Worker from 2019. These are important publications because somehow try to reread the history of the ILO through the gender perspective. On the one hand, the first one, Women's ILO, consider both women as subject which who interacts with the ILO history, and somehow as also a protagonist. On the other hand, this book addresses several conventions which are really related to women's work. So this is one of the first publication of such a complexity, which clearly addressed diverse aspects of the relationship between women and ILO throughout the 20th century up to the 21st century. The second publication made by Eileen Boris is also important because somehow this scholar reread the history of the 20th century up to the 21st century through the main convention regarding women's work, try to conceptualize such a long period by adopting concept that we will also adopt today in this lecture. For instance, production, reproduction, but also on the other hand, equality, protection. So this is a very important book if someone would be interested in, let's say, knowing more about such a topic. Well, it's very, it's not so, let's say, visible, so I will try just to put few points from this slide. There were several conventions which addressed explicitly women's work or specific, let's say, typology, category of workers. Mostly of them are women. So for instance, there are conventions which address equal pay on the one hand, that is called equal remuneration, and we will see in the ILO language, but also equality of treatment, the issue of discrimination, and several others. But there are also conventions which addresses, for instance, domestic workers, part-time workers, or even home workers. And of course, these are not conventions which address women's work specifically, but we know that most of these workers are women, so somehow are considered very related to women's work and women's condition in the labor market. I will make the slide available after the lesson if you want, so you can better check from the slide afterwards, because here I see it's a bit small to read properly. But just remember that there are a few pillars that we can, let's say, remind today. On the one hand, I already said the issue of maternity is very crucial since the very foundation of the ILO 1919. One of the very first convention was regarded explicitly maternity, but on the other hand, you have the more general issue of equality, as I mentioned before, and here equal remuneration is also considered a fundamental convention among the few conventions which are considered again fundamental for the ILO. On the other hand, you have also conventions which are important to stress again equality. So Convention Against Discrimination in Employment, for instance, and others which also addressed, for instance, workers with family responsibility. And again, here we consider women the most involved in this specific aspect. And this is the reason why Eileen Boris basically put together all this convention when she addresses women's work in her book. But what I would like to say today is that why conventions are important for you, and more in general for the history of the ILO, but also for the ILO in the present, okay? And how, I mean, a convention is something that has, let's say, an international scope, right? But what is not obvious is that a convention can play a really relevant role also at local level. This is the reason why I try to unpack some concept that can be useful, I think, to better understand the historical rule and also the contemporary rule of conventions, not just conventions on women's work, but more in general. And again, on the one hand, we need to think that a convention is basically, I mean, requires after being approved at Geneva to be ratified, and after being ratified, needs to be implemented. This is not an obvious process, as I will try to explain later with some example. But the relationship between the local dimension and the transnational dimension is very important, because if the local is not part of such a process, basically the convention, I mean, can remain like dead letter, okay? So cannot have any kind of function, any kind of importance if at the local and national level is not perceived as something relevant, and no one basically try to implement it. This is the reason why it's so relevant to look at this different level of scale. And for instance, I add in this slide a small picture that regard the application of international labor standard in 2022, because the convention, once are ratified, are monitored. So this means that their own implementation is monitored at, let's say, international level, because each country had to basically write a report about each convention which have been ratified. So this is the overall process, and these kind of documents historically are relevant, because we as historians can understand if a convention was important or not, if a convention was applied and to what extent was applied, and which were, for instance, the problems in implementing such principle. So these are just examples that hopefully can show you why these documents are important, and how this document can be used, not just as international declaration or regulation, but also in specific places. And how do we understand the relevance of a convention or another? We can understand that if we see, and this is my case, and I will show you some example about that, how a convention is implemented in a country, and which kind of difference there were between the implementation in one country and in another one. And when I say the macro level, it means you can see if a convention is a matter in a specific country of political discussion or not, or was just, for instance, ratified but never discussed, or never basically implemented, because sometimes this happens also regarding women's work. Yeah, another thing I would like to, let's say, introduce to you, and then you will see in the example, is the fact that not always the chronology of the ILO convention is basically relevant for the development of national legislation. Sometimes it's very relevant, other times it's not. And we will see a couple of examples that can reveal why and how there were these kind of differences. Another thing I would like to, let's say, raise is the fact that for understanding why and how conventions are relevant, you need to look at the action of various agents. How, for instance, women's association decide to pick a convention and use it in order to put forward their own claim regarding the very same subject, okay? Not just women's association, trade unions, philanthropic association, in addition, of course, to the national government. So these are, let's say, possible perspectives through which you can better understand not just the history of the conventions, but also how they function in the current period. And we will see some examples. In my own research, let's say, I decided to, let's say here, just provide you some basic elements regarding some of the conventions that were quoted before by Eileen Boris in the slide, which are very relevant in the overall discussion of women's work and what happened, for instance, in Italy, since you are doing this master here in Padova. First of all, I mentioned the Maternity Protection Convention. That was one of the first one, the number 3 in 1919. What is relevant to know that this convention has been revised more than once, and in Italy was ratified after a few decades in 1952, the first one, and after in 1971. It's relevant to know that, for instance, in Italy, we have 2 laws that are quite similar in terms of chronology to the ratification of that convention. In fact, we have a first law in 1950 regarding working mother, and another one in 1871. And the data of the ratification are quite similar. On the other hand, another example that is going to be further implemented in a few minutes regard the Convention on Equal Remuneration. As I said before, this is one of the main relevant convention among the 190 existing, and it's a fundamental convention, as you have seen. Equal remuneration, equal pay more in general is one of the pillars of the ILO Constitution and also the Declaration of Philadelphia. This was ratified in 1956. And then we'll see in the following slides why it's so relevant, this example. There were other regarding discrimination, for instance, in employment, which also addressed the issue of discrimination for gender or sex. Another one relevant regard the human source development, so which addressed the issue of vocational training. As we have seen in the previous slide, also the equality in vocational training and training in general was one of the pillar also of the Declaration of Philadelphia. So these conventions are basically implementing also principles that were already in that important document. Domestic Workers Convention is another one very important for women's work. This is very recent. A decade ago was approved in Geneva, and Italy ratified it just a couple of years later. And the very last one, and we will see more detail about this convention, is the Convention for the Elimination of Violence and Harassment in the World of Work. And this was approved in 2019 and was ratified in 2021. So last year, basically, in Italy. Italy is one of the first European countries which ratify this very last ILO convention. On the other hand, Italy never ratified two important conventions. The first regarding women's workers, with family responsibilities, which saw 45 ratification. And the second one is the Home Work Convention, which is dated 1996, and this is a convention which was ratified by only 12 countries. And we will see, let's say, that this convention is really relevant today in spite of this low rate of ratification. So this was, let's say, a picture of the convention that are relevant in terms of women's work and how they were basically ratified and when in Italy. But I decided to focus on three main examples because they are quite different among themselves, but they are relevant to talk about this issue of how we can, let's say, use the concept of production and reproduction as a lens to understand the relationship between women's work and ILO convention. This is a picture of the report and the session where the Equal Remuneration Convention was approved. The convention was approved in 1951, and the correct title is Equal Remuneration for Men and Women Workers for Work of Equal Value. But I would like to share with you the very same definition because in the longer history of the struggle, the international struggle for equal pay, this very same definition was very important. Was very important because, why? Because it's a very broad definition. Equal remuneration for men and women workers for work of equal value. It is not stated same work, but work of equal value. For instance, the Italian Constitution also included the principle of equal pay in its own, let's say, article, but what is stated in the Italian Constitution is that equal remuneration for men and women for work for the same work, and this is a narrow definition. Also, the Treaty of Rome, if we look at the European context, use this narrow definition. So the ILO Convention was considered by several countries very advanced and very important because this definition somehow allow to go beyond the fact that women and men sometimes did not do exactly the same work. And this was one of the reasons why in the longer struggle of for equal pay, women's work was basically devalued and considered of less value than men's work. Okay, so this is the reason why I focus on this specific aspect. On the other hand, it is clarified by the convention how we consider remuneration. So the term remuneration includes ordinary, basic, or minimum wage or salary, and any additional emoluments whatsoever payable directly or indirectly. Because why is relevant this, let's say, additional sentence? Because sometimes women were discriminated against also, for instance, if there was a scheme of piecework rate, okay? So we're not just discriminated because they were women, but if there were an additional part of the salary, sometimes this kind of discrimination was also added. So women were discriminated twice in that kind of example I brought to you. So these very same definitions are very important for that reason. But just a few examples regarding the ratification. In the 1950s, so in the first, let's say, decade, since the approval, there were some Western European countries which ratified, the convention: Italy, France, Austria, and Iceland. Some Eastern European countries, Romania, Poland, and on the other hand, USSR. There were South American countries, Argentina, Brazil, and there were also Central American countries, plus India and Indonesia, if we look at the Asian context. And what has emerged from research from, let's say, scholars around the world is that there were like common elements among countries which ratified the convention in the 50s. So some of them, for instance, as Italy, put equal pay in their own, let's say, constitutional charter. So this is something relevant, for instance. But on the other hand, I wanted to, let's say, give you a sense of the country which never ratified the convention. The most striking one is the USA. So the United States never ratified such convention. Well, the relationship between USA and let's say the ILO convention is quite peculiar, let's say, because it is not a country which ratified many conventions as others. We have to, let's say, stick to this very basic concept, but you can see also the other countries which never ratified. But it's quite interesting to see how across decades, different countries around the world, for a total of 173, basically adopted this kind of definition and let's say decide to commit themselves to apply the principle of equal remuneration. What happened in Italy? And this is an example that can show you how convention can be used at national level to put forward struggles which were already in place. Because in Italy, the struggle for equal pay, was dated back to the late 19th century. But if we look at the post-World War II period, we see that since the early, let's say, 1950s, there were bill of law trying to implement the principle of equal pay, because the principle was already in the Constitution, but never really applied. We have bill of law by trade unionists. Teresa Noce, for instance, who was also an international figure because she was in charge of the International Union of Textile and Clothing Workers for almost a decade. But in the end of the 1950s and early 1960s, in Italy, there were different attempts to, let's say, implement the ILO Convention, because the convention was ratified in 1956. But this did not imply that something changed immediately. And so women association, especially, lobbied to get the convention implemented through bill of law, mobilization, and it was very difficult because let's say the entrepreneurs and their own association were very hostile. And this is the reason why it was so difficult to get a law approved, and they did not succeed in such an attempt until 1977. So almost, let's say, 2 decades after, with a more comprehensive law that established in 1977 full equality between female and male workers, including the issue of equal pay. So equal pay was finally solved in Italy in 1977. But in the 1950s, the struggle had a result, an important result, because after 1960, basically, the pay scheme was no longer organized by sex, okay? Before you have women workers and men workers. And sometimes women workers were paid less, not just compared to men with the same qualification, but also with lower qualification. And this was a formal discrimination. After 1960, this did no longer happen in the industrial sector, when in the agriculture, a law was basically approved in 1964. What is relevant here? To understand that the convention played a role, a relevant role, in order to create an alliance between women's association, trade unions, and also to push the government to do something. Because before, in spite of the fact that there was a principle in the Italian constitution, nothing happened. And also trade unions were quite shy because they were afraid of possible women's competition in the labor market. So we have a clear example of the possible importance of the convention at national, but also local level here. Another relevant thing that came out from my research is the timing of equal pay struggle that is in line with a more international, let's say, background. On the one hand, the Italians played a role in the international arena, both in women's association and trade unions, International Federation of Trade Unions. On the other hand, we are in a period of the Cold War. You talk about Cold War, and here, if we look at the specific context, we should consider the relevance of the Catholic and communist, let's say, rivalry, because it is relevant for Italian history and not just Italian history. But in spite of that, the convention helped to mobilize both sides. So this is another important aspect which came out from the analysis of the convention. Another important aspect which connect the issue of equal pay to the issue of women's work value more in general is the fact that when you think about the issue of unequal wages, there is not just a matter of formal, let's say, discrimination. It's also a matter of how women's work is valued. So if you basically downgrade women's work, you create not a formal discrimination, but a substantial discrimination, which can impact strongly the issue of equal remuneration on the one hand, but more in general, impact what today we call gender pay gap. And these are kind of substantial, let's say, discrimination in wages, which basically are long-term issues and still contemporary issue. Another important aspect which came out from the comparative studies of the conventions and how they were applied in Cold War Europe is the fact that there was an exchange of model between the West and the East. So basically, equal pay was something that was at a certain point discussed also in Eastern Europe. In Hungary, we have research made on Hungary and on Poland. What emerges is quite striking compared to the Italian context I basically talked to you about. The fact that in Eastern Europe and in USSR, equal pay was not considered an issue. Equal pay was granted, was taken for granted, because it's something very related to the ideology itself. But empirical research made by trade unionists, for instance, and scholars between the late 60s and the early 70s basically revealed that there were really similar issues regarding, for instance, the devaluing of women's work, or what we call today the so-called gender segregation in the labor market and also at the workplaces. And so this was something really interesting to understand and create a base for further researching such issue in beyond, let's say, the Iron Curtain that often is considered something we cannot, let's say, overcome also in research, not just in the past. Another example I wanted to show with you today is completely different from the previous one, and it regards homework that is probably the most relevant form of work which combine production and reproduction, because home workers work inside a home and basically had to combine different kind of tasks at the same time. You can show in this picture that was taken from the ILO database, a woman in her home with the sewing machine. That is the typical example of homework in, let's say, the very long period. But there are other more contemporary examples that in a minute I will show you. What is relevant to know in very basic, in a very basic chronology? That homework was discussed in 1919 and was like considered as an evil form of work. This was the concept which was used, but at the same time was considered something very difficult to regulate, to, let's say, discipline. And the reason was very connected to the fact that inspection inside the house, inside the home, was considered something impossible. Okay, this was one of the reasons why they did not regulate homework in 1919. But after almost 80 years, there was a convention on precisely homework. Convention 177, which established equality of treatment between home workers and other wage earners. And the background, I mean, the definition is very relevant, because one of the main problems in the history of home-based work and industrial homework, as we as scholars called it in Western countries, is properly the definition. And the convention defined homework as a work carried out by a person in his or her home or in other premises of his or her choice, other than the workplace of the employer, for remuneration, which results in a product or service as specified by the employer, irrespective of who provides the equipment, the materials, and other inputs used. In this very same definition, you find some of issues that were discussed in the decades, let's say, in the previous decades. And it's very much relevant why there was a convention in 1996. Scholars who basically investigate this process try to understand, first of all, the periodization. So industrial homework, or more in general, home-based work, is a continuous phenomenon. This is the major point, but there were, let's say, diverse phases of development, not properly crisis, I would say, but development, different phase of development. For long time, for this period, the so-called golden age of the 20th century was considered a period where home-based work basically reduced, at least in Western countries. I will show you in a minute an example which demonstrates that this is not the case everywhere in Western countries. But what is very common is that the capitalist restructuring that started in the 70s and were emphasized by, let's say, the wave of the globalization that we basically saw in the 90s, create, let's say, the condition for further spread of home-based work, especially in global South countries. Not just in global South countries. Several research underlined that the major changes occurring in the industrial system, in the Fordist industrial model, basically led also to changes in the production in Western countries, such as, for instance, the United States. So there were research also on a new spread of home-based work in the United States of the 1980s and 90s. There is a big conceptual issue here, because for a long time, industrial, in particular, industrial homework was considered a backward production. What we understand instead from the history of this form of production throughout the 20th century is that this specific form of work is very persistent, is very convenient, and this is the reason why it basically spread throughout the century up to nowadays, and we will see in a minute in the figure. Yeah, we have a very different situation in the Italian context. 1996 ILO Convention. In the Italian context, instead, we have what I call divergent chronology, because the discussion on home-based industrial work dated back the 1950s. And we have two major laws which try to regulate this kind of work and which try to improve the condition of home workers in 1958 and in 1973. So after 15 years, basically. And there were a very high number of home workers in Italy. In 1968, there were 1,500,000 according to some estimates. So, and you have to think that women's employment was basically between 3 and 4 times of this number. So, I mean, was a huge number of, especially women, who did this kind of work. You see in the picture the typical issue of combining work inside the house with the reproductive function. You can see a child and a woman working on this sewing machine and a child at the same time, and the woman was supposed to take care of both of the productive and the reproductive duties at the same time. And this is a picture taken from a women's magazine of the 1950s. But women's homework, home-based work is something of the past? No, the answer is no. We are talking about this example because it's very relevant today. It's really relevant, and the ILO report from 2021 basically stated that we have 260 million of home-based workers in 2019. So before the COVID started, okay, before the pandemic and its consequences around the world. And of course, these are estimates that are not, as you can imagine, taken from official census in many cases, so you have to consider that this figure could be higher, okay? Yes, they represent an important share of global employment. So this is the first concept I would like to share with you. And this is the reason why I picked this example, this convention, and this kind of work. Where is spread this kind of work? Of course, there are countries where is more relevant than others. In Europe is, we can say in general, less relevant, at least certain forms are less relevant. For some countries, there are no data. Other countries are more relevant for the overall phenomena. But here is clearer. These are figures taken from Vigo. I don't know if you have ever heard of Vigo, but it's a very relevant, let's say, network. Vigo stands for Women in Informal Employment, Globalizing and Organizing. It's a huge network of activists who played a big role in organizing women who are working in the informal economy, included home-based workers. And you can see how differently home-based workers are present in the different countries. In addition to this, I would like also to explain that nowadays we have different kind of home-based workers. This is quite obvious after COVID probably, but in the ILO report is very interesting because it provides figure and analysis regarding all the three kind of home workers here stated. So industrial homework, this is the form I showed you before, also with the Italian example, and this is the longer term form of home-based work. The most recent telework and the digital platform work. Nowadays, in the home-based, let's say, work, all this kind of work are included. And you can understand by yourself that they are very different among each other. So we have to think about the fact that industrial homework involved mostly women and other workers in the global south, above all, while telework is often present in Western and other, let's say, low and high income countries. For the digital platform work is a bit different, but I'm not going to detail now because it's something for, let's say, probably also other colleagues. But I mean, the recent development has shown that there are some forms of digital platform work that are quite similar in terms of work organization and related issues to industrial homework for the issue of piece rate scheme and other aspects. But to be, because time is going fast, which are the problems with home-based work? First of all, the lower remuneration compared to non-home-based work. The blurring between working time and personal and family time, you saw quite clearly in the picture I showed you before, this aspect. The social protection gaps, because many home-based workers are not employees, but they are self-employed, and several times with no proper labor contracts of any kind. And so in this case, they are properly in the formal economy, and for this reason, they have no social protection, more healthy and safety risk, isolation and lack of awareness of legal rights, obstacle to participation in trade union, less training opportunity, as I said before, high level of informality and precarity connected, and something not obvious but very important, the lack of recognition of the status of worker. These are quite interesting concepts because I found them in my own study on industrial home-based workers in 1960s and 1970s Italy, but are still characterizing today's condition of millions of home-based workers around the world. So I just wanted to, let's say, give you a sense of the ongoing issue these kind of workers are facing. And this is quite interesting book that came out last year and combine historical and also activist perspective and give a sense of the relevance of this phenomenon throughout the 1920s and up to the 21st centuries, looking at Western countries from the global north and also countries from the global south. So if someone is interested, this could be an example. We have 50 minutes more. Okay, so I'll go back to the last part of the presentation. And I hope that you will be interested of this one because this is the path which led to the very last Convention 190. This is just a summary of what preceded the Convention 190, because the issue of violence and harassment in the world of work is connected firstly with the issue of violence against women and more in general to discrimination. Because when we talk about violence and harassment in the world of work, research indicates that there were issues often of discrimination and of imbalance of power behind this phenomena. So this is the reason why I quoted that. But these are just some UN especially relevant documents and convention to let's say put in a longer historical perspective Convention 190. And of course, it's relevant to understand that, let's say, the 70s were crucial to put forward a process of, let's say, improvement of women's condition around the world, also regarding women workers' condition, and the 1975 Declaration on Equality of Opportunity and Treatment for Women Workers from the ILO was an important document on that regard. But the UN Convention Against Discrimination are also crucial in this path, together with the Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women. So this is the context which preceded the 190 Convention. And when started to be discussed the issue of violence and sexual harassment at the workplace, well, in a recent article, Erin Boris stressed that these were discussed in the 1990s, both at the UN and at the ILO. So there were meetings, seminars, and conferences which addressed this specific aspect. But how and why this convention was approved? Well, first of all, we need to say that before its approval in 2019, there was a very important alliance between NGO and trade unions to support the, let's say, approval of this convention, a specific rule of the already mentioned VIGO and also of the International Domestic Worker Federation. You can see the acronym here. And of course, there was the Me Too movement that played also a role in the overall discussion. So these are kind of precondition to the approval of 2019, in 2019 of the 190 Convention. Why is relevant this convention? And which are the main pillars in, let's say, tips? Well, the first thing is that the convention basically stated that violence and harassment in the world of work constitute a human rights violation or abuse. So this is the reason why I brought you this example today, but is also considered a threat, not just to equal opportunity, but also to decent work. And these are quite relevant concepts in the overall history of the discussion on this specific aspect. The convention aims at promoting zero tolerance to violence and harassment. But the point is how these are defined. How are defined violence and harassment? Not just at the workplace, this is important, but in the world of work is a wider definition, and I will explain you why. This kind of phenomena are defined as unacceptable behavior and practices which may result in physical, psychological, sexual, or economic harm, and includes gender-based violence and harassment. Why is so relevant? Because we have in mind that when you talk about violence and harassment, you have in mind, usually, not you, but in general, we have in mind sexual harassment, full stop. Here is a wider definition, so the point is that not just a sexual harassment or violence occur, but the fact that this can be a risk or can be a threat, and a person may lose, for instance, a career opportunity because it's discriminated, because they're not, let's say, comply with this kind of violence or harassment. So this is a very crucial definition because it applies at a wider range of situations, not just the physical, let's say, sexual harassment, which happen, but also the chance that this kind of phenomena basically damage the person, the victim, the possible victim. So it's something really, really wider. Gender-based violence, because it's clear that these kind of phenomena have a major impact on women, but not just women, okay? This is important also to say, because also the figure shows that a percentage of men are also involved in such phenomena, although they are less, okay? But I would like also to stress this aspect, which are not obvious, because it's not just the workplace in itself, but also the place where the worker is paid, where there is a break, the sanitary, the washing, the facilities, doing work-related trips, travel, etc., and also in different ways, including work-related communication. So again, this is a broader, very broader definition, and for that reason is very important. On the other hand, also the people who are protected are more from all sectors, private, public, formal, informal economy, and also urban and rural areas, not just employees, but all the people, let's say, active in the labor field, and also trainees, intern, apprentice, volunteer, job seeker, and others. So you can understand probably from that definition the broad scope of this convention. As I said, it was approved in Geneva in 2019. You can see here a picture of the 108th session when it was approved, and some picture about the attempt of let's say, of the campaign for the ratification of the convention from Union and the ILO itself. And now there is, for the one of you who can be interested to know more, an entire portal on the ILO website where you can, let's say, have more information about this convention and the way that can be relevant to implement, on the one hand, the convention and not just to ratify. There is a clear attempt in this moment, this very same moment, by the ILO and the National Office of the ILO for ratifying and implementing this convention. And I've been also part of such an effort in Italy. And I would like to show you just a couple of slides, are just images, but one of the relevant aspect is let's say, raising awareness, educating, preventing this kind of phenomena. And with the ILO office for Italy and San Marino, we established a website where there are information about ILO convention, with the idea that is relevant also for teenager and high school students to know more about which are the fundamental labor rights, and also this kind of convention in specific. And these are some picture of this website I wanted to show you. I think we are, let's say, at the end of the lesson, but I will give you, let's say, this slide if you think are useful, no problem for that. Just let me say of two documents that can be relevant for knowing more about the relationship between the women's work, the ILO, and the current situation. In 2019 was made this relevant report that basically tried to understand what was the situation of women workers after, let's say, 1 century of action of the ILO. And this is, you will see later on if you like, but these are in very some basic figure, the data which might help you in understanding the still ongoing issues in terms of discrimination, unequal distribution of care duties, for instance, the lack of opportunities of women in terms of career, especially women with young children, and the gender pay gap we mentioned before. So this is an infographic very useful to, let's say, have a sense of what has been achieved, but also what is still to be, let's say, gained for the future. And I will leave you to read this alone if you like, because of course, since the situation in 2019, the COVID pandemic had a deep impact on women's work from several points of view. Unemployment, for instance, is one of the issue, but also we can say the big issue of work-life balance. If we think about the closure of childcare and related services, and several other aspects that can be, let's say, understood from the ILO discussion, the ILO ongoing discussion about a possible gender equal COVID-19 recovery, or a situation that seems more gender unequal at the moment. So these are open challenges, and I hope that also my lesson today give you a sense of the importance of women's work in the ILO history, but also the importance of the ILO action towards the improvement of women's work in historical and also contemporary perspective. Thank you very much. Few.
Maybe I also suggest something, because I don't know if I have your authorization, but starting from, I also say this because I come here. I start usually on Mondays, like today, from 4:30. I start my office time. I usually meet those students. And since Eloisa is my guest today, she shares the office with me. If you want to ask something to her in the same hour and a half from 4:30 to 6.
I will be happy to.
Sorry if I said this without your authorization, but if you're interested,
sure.
okay, she will be there, Via del Santo number 77, second floor. Okay. Okay. I have a couple of questions.
Yeah.
If you don't, if you do.
One
Okay.
question.
So please.
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think I put in the slide a link through which you can go to directly to the ratification. Let's see if function, because yesterday it did. Yeah. Let's see if. Yeah, there are 12 countries at the moment, and yeah. Yeah, now I just
in some cases I
do not.
only a procedural.
Yeah, there is a direct link here from the slide, but now I cannot really open it, sorry. But yeah, well, Italy was, I think, probably the first to ratify with Greece, but I need to recheck that. But yeah, let's say that the process is quite fast at the moment, because you can see, I mean, compared to the 1986 convention, you can see the same rata, and the ratification has started only, I mean, in mid-2019. There is a huge mobilization at the moment for ratifying this convention, and I think what was said by Lynn Boris is true. The Me Too movement give, let's say, help in this direction to speak more about a phenomenon that I did not mention, but I will now. It's very difficult to tackle, because it's very invisible. I mean, it's very difficult to find data about that, and it's difficult that women workers especially basically denounce what happens. So there is a lot of work to do on that side.
Important things, but very shortly. First, you mentioned the support, especially for example, for the approval of this last convention, 190 on sexual harassment at work. You mentioned the support of the trade unions, so also the male component of the trade unions. But you have studied also convention number 100 of the 1950s. Can you see a difference, a shift in the male component of the workers in supporting this kind of topics or goals?
I think, I mean, the time difference between the approval and the ratification of the 100 Convention on Equal Remuneration and this last one basically help to understand that, for sure, at least in some countries, I mean, some difficulties, I think, have been overcome on the male side, but we need to remember that in the overall approval process of the 190 Convention on Violence and Harassment, in the world of work, there was a big rule of the International Domestic Federation. So basically, a women, mostly federation of trade unions and association, and on the other end of NGO like Vigo. So I think there was a big push on the female side, but of course, since many unions are male-dominated, there was at least a support, at least a solidarity, I would say, compared to what happened let's say, with the 100 Convention, but because at the time, in most countries like Italy, the male part of the union was basically against. And this is the reason why it was so difficult to get equal pay in place, because the male, let's say, delegates of the union and also officials several times were worried about the impact on women's, on men's employment of this equality. So, and resistance were really clear also in written documents. I think nowadays the cultural situation is different, of course, and also this movement, not just the Me Too, but also the so-called third wave feminist around the world in, let's say, different waves or kind of organization, played a role at the present moment compared to the 50s. Of course, the 70s were different, but still the resistance also in Western countries were much higher than nowadays, I would say. What is true is that violence and sexual harassment are very common and very problematic, especially in sectors such as domestic work. So this is one of the reasons why the International Federation was so active. Of course, in all the informal situation, because the least right you have, the more vulnerable you are. I mean, this is on that regard, and so. Thank you for your attention. I hope it was also interesting. Thank you very much.
Okay, so yes.
Thank you.
Only last week. Ah, yes, but it was wrong.
Yes.
You didn't.
We were.
Did you? Really?